It is the 1st of February 1944, and inside Block F at Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, a young Wren named Dorothy Du Boisson is standing before 8 feet of humming valves and spinning paper tape, watching a machine that officially does not exist. The room smells of hot dust and machine oil. Somewhere beneath her hands, a loop of tape is traveling past a photoelectric reader at nearly 30 miles an hour. So fast that engineers worry it might tear itself apart from centrifugal force alone. Rows of thermionic valves glow orange in the dim light, more than 1,500 of them, wired into a machine so large that staff have already given it a nickname simply because of its size. They call it Colossus. Nobody in that room is permitted to say what it does. Nobody outside a tiny circle of engineers, mathematicians, and senior officers is permitted to know it exists at all. The operators have signed the Official Secrets Act, understanding that discussing their work, even decades later, even to a spouse or a grandchild, will remain a criminal offense. Whatever happens in this room, whatever this machine achieves, the world is not meant to find out. Not now, not for a very long time. What is being built inside Block F, quietly and without ceremony, is the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. It will not be recognized as such for another generation because the people who built it will be forbidden from saying so. It will read German high command communications, the messages passing directly between Hitler and his generals, at a moment when the outcome of the war still hangs in painful uncertainty. It will help the Allies confirm that Adolf Hitler has been fooled by the Normandy deception, freeing planners to commit to the invasion date with something close to confidence. And then, when the war ends, it will be broken apart, its plans burned, its existence buried so completely that even the men who won a Nobel Prize for post-war computing will not know their predecessor came first. This is the story of a machine so secret that Britain would spend 30 years pretending it had never been built, and the story of why that secrecy very nearly cost the country credit for inventing the computer age. By the early years of the war, Britain already had a code-breaking triumph to its name. Bletchley Park's mathematicians, Alan Turing chief among them, had found ways to break the German Enigma machine, the cipher device used across much of the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine. But by 1940, German High Command had begun using something else entirely for its most sensitive traffic, a teleprinter cipher machine built by the Lorenz Company, designated the SZ42 and known at Bletchley by the codename Tunny. This was not Enigma. It was the cipher of Hitler's own staff, of army group commanders, of the traffic that revealed strategic intentions rather than tactical detail. If Enigma told the Allies what a U-boat captain planned for tomorrow, Tunny threatened to tell them what the German High Command planned for the rest of the war. The scale of the challenge was staggering. Lorenz used 12 wheels, each with a different number of pins, generating a key stream of such complexity that the number of possible wheel settings ran into the hundreds of billions. Unlike Enigma, no captured machine ever fell into British hands during the crucial early period. The mathematician William Tutt and his colleagues had to reconstruct the entire logical structure of the Lorenz machine in 1941 purely by studying the intercepted ciphertext, without ever seeing the device itself, a feat still regarded as one of the great intellectual achievements of the war. Working out the pattern was one problem. Actually breaking daily traffic at any usable speed was another altogether. Before any machine entered the picture, the breaking of Tunny traffic depended almost entirely on human error on the German side. In August 1941, a German operator retransmitted a lengthy message using the same wheel settings as an earlier attempt, a lapse in procedure that gave Bletchley's analysts 2 versions of nearly the same plaintext enciphered with an identical key. From that single mistake, Tutt and his colleagues reverse-engineered the entire logical architecture of a machine none of them had ever seen or touched. It was an extraordinary piece of mathematics, but it was also, crucially, unrepeatable. The Germans would not oblige with the same mistake twice, and daily operational code breaking could not be built on the hope of further lapses. What Bletchley needed was a way to attack the cipher on its own terms, mechanically and at speed, for every single day of the war that remained. The scale of that daily task is worth dwelling on. Each Lorenz message was enciphered using 12 separate wheels, 5 of which controlled the core substitution pattern, 5 more added a further layer of complexity, and 2 governed irregular stepping motions that made the whole system resistant to straightforward mechanical attack. The number of theoretically possible starting positions for these wheels ran into the hundreds of billions, and even once statistical methods narrowed the search considerably, working out the correct settings for a single day's traffic by hand, using pencil, paper, and mechanical calculating aids, could consume the concentrated effort of a large team for the better part of a week. Given that German commanders changed some elements of their settings daily and the whole wheel pattern periodically, intelligence that arrived 7 days late told you what the enemy had been planning a week ago, not what they intended to do next. In a war being decided in weeks rather than years, that lag was close to worthless. The first attempt at a solution was an electromechanical machine nicknamed Heath Robinson, after the cartoonist famous for drawing absurdly complicated contraptions. It used 2 paper tapes running in synchronization, counting matches between the enciphered message and a trial key. It worked, but it was temperamental, slow, and prone to the tapes stretching or slipping out of alignment, sometimes tearing themselves to pieces under the strain of running at speed. Keeping 2 paper loops of different lengths running in perfect synchrony at any real speed proved to be an almost impossible engineering problem in itself. A fractional stretch in one tape relative to the other, caused by nothing more than humidity in the air, could throw an entire run out of alignment and force the process to begin again. Breaking a single day's tunny traffic could take so long that the intelligence, by the time it emerged, risked being of only historical rather than operational value. Codebreakers were fighting the clock as much as the cipher. Something faster was needed, and by 1943, nobody at Bletchley was confident such a thing could be built in time to matter. The man who solved it was not a career cryptographer, but a telephone engineer. Tommy Flowers worked at the General Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill in northwest London, where he had spent years developing electronic switching equipment for the telephone network. Brought in to help improve Heath Robinson, Flowers concluded that the entire approach was wrong. Rather than running 2 paper tapes together, mechanically vulnerable and limited in speed, he proposed generating one of the 2 data streams electronically inside valve circuitry, and running only a single tape at high speed past a photoelectric reading head. It was a radical idea, and it relied on an assumption almost nobody at Bletchley Park shared, that a machine built from more than 1,000 valves could run reliably for hours at a time. Valves had a reputation for burning out, and the received wisdom held that a machine using so many of them would fail constantly. Flowers disagreed, based on years spent watching the telephone exchange network, which already ran on thousands of valves kept permanently switched on rather than being turned on and off, since it was the thermal shock of power cycling, he believed, that caused most failures. Bletchley's management was skeptical enough that Flowers received only lukewarm official backing. He built the prototype anyway, drawing on his own funds and the resources of the Dollis Hill Research Station, working with a team that included Sidney Broadhurst, William Chandler, and Alan Coombs. In 11 months, working at a pace that left little room for a private life, they built the first Colossus. It was, by any standard of the period, an enormous machine, filling a room roughly the size of a small warehouse floor, standing around 7 feet tall and stretching some 16 feet across in its later form, built from racks of thermionic valves, relays, and switching circuits mounted on a metal frame. The paper tape carrying the intercepted ciphertext was read at around 5,000 characters a second by a photoelectric system that Flowers designed specifically to avoid the mechanical strain that had plagued Heath Robinson, the tape moving so quickly that it produced an audible shriek, something engineers later compared to a very loud dentist's drill running continuously for hours. Inside, the machine performed Boolean logical comparisons, essentially testing thousands of possible wheel settings electronically and counting statistical matches at speeds no human team or electromechanical device could approach. Where Heath Robinson had needed hours or days, Colossus could work through comparable calculations vastly faster, turning a task that felt endless into one that fit inside an operational time frame. Who worked near it was roughly what a shift beside Colossus sounded like. To picture its scale, imagine a modern shipping container standing on end and packed floor to ceiling with radio valves, wiring looms, and switch panels, radiating enough heat from those glowing valves that operators in winter found it one of the more agreeable postings at Bletchley Park, and one of the least agreeable in summer. Before Colossus, the largest number of valves reliably operated together in a single machine anywhere is generally put at around 150. Flowers was proposing to run 10 times that many continuously, a jump in scale that struck many contemporaries as reckless rather than ambitious. Manufacture itself had to be spread across several sites to maintain both pace and secrecy, with valves, switches, and specialist components sourced through the post office's existing telephone supply network under the cover of routine communications equipment, so that even the firms supplying parts had no clear picture of what they were ultimately building. Assembly of the core machine took place at the Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill, with final assembly and testing completed on site at Bletchley Park by a small team working against a backdrop of constant operational pressure, since every additional week without a working machine was a week of German high command traffic going unread. Production figures for the full run of 10 Colossi, and the 11th machine still being completed as the war in Europe ended, remains somewhat uncertain even today, since so much of the paperwork documenting individual builds was destroyed alongside the machines themselves. Historians generally rely on surviving fragments, veteran testimony, and the reconstructed engineering drawings assembled decades later, rather than any single authoritative production ledger. The prototype, later known as Colossus Mark I, ran successfully at Dollis Hill in November 1943, was dismantled, transported to Bletchley Park, and reassembled there by engineers Harry Fensom and Don Horwood, becoming operational in early February 1944. It carried around 1,500 valves. Flowers was already at work on an improved version, and Colossus Mark II, with some 2,400 valves and additional parallel processing circuitry that made it around 5 times faster still, entered service on the 1st of June 1944, just days before the Normandy landings. By the end of the war in Europe, 10 Colossi were operating at Bletchley Park, with an 11th under construction, 7 machines dedicated to establishing daily wheel settings, and 3 to the deeper mathematical work of wheel braking, running around the clock in continuous shifts staffed largely by Wrens of the Women's Royal Naval Service, who worked in small teams, changing tapes, resetting switch panels according to instructions from the mathematicians upstairs, and recording results on an attached electric typewriter, often with only a fragmentary sense of the wider significance of what they were producing. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The intelligence Colossus produced, codenamed Ultra alongside material from Enigma decryption, went to a remarkably small circle of recipients, including Winston Churchill himself. Perhaps its most significant documented contribution came in the run-up to D-Day. Through tunny traffic passing between Berlin and German commanders in France, Bletchley was able to confirm that the deception operation built around the fictional 1st United States Army Group, intended to convince Hitler that the main invasion would fall at Calais rather than Normandy, was working. Decrypted Lorentz traffic revealed the disposition of German panzer divisions and the extent to which German high command still believed Calais to be the primary target even after the Normandy landings had begun, intelligence that allowed Allied planners to proceed with a confidence that raw guesswork could never have supplied. Precisely how many individual decisions were shaped by Colossus' output remains difficult to reconstruct, since so much of the surrounding record was destroyed, and historians are generally careful to say that its influence was significant rather than singularly decisive, one thread among the many that ran through Allied planning in the final year of the war. What is not in doubt is the psychological weight the operators themselves carried. Many of the young women running Colossus around the clock had little idea what the messages they processed actually said, working instead to strict procedural instructions, feeding tape, adjusting settings. To picture the noise of the thing, imagine standing beside a road drill running continuously in an enclosed room, mixed with the low electrical hum of a small power station. Because that, according to those, reading results from an electric typewriter without necessarily understanding the strategic value of what passed through their hands. Some later described the peculiar loneliness of doing vital war work they could never mention, not to family, not to friends, not even to other people working elsewhere at Bletchley Park, who lacked the specific clearance for tunny material. No German equivalent to Colossus existed. The Lorentz machine's own manufacturers had no comparable electronic code-breaking capability, and German cryptographic effort remained rooted in manual and electromechanical methods throughout the war, partly because German intelligence services significantly underestimated Allied code-breaking capacity and never seriously suspected that Lorentz traffic was being read at all. Nor did the Americans have anything resembling Colossus during the war years. The machine, generally credited as the first general-purpose electronic digital computer in open historical memory, the American ENIAC, was not completed until 1945 and was not declared operational until February 1946, some 2 years after Colossus Mark I had already been breaking Lorentz traffic at Bletchley Park. Colossus was, in the strict technical sense, first, using vacuum tube logic circuits to perform high-speed digital calculation years before that achievement became public knowledge anywhere in the world. And that is precisely where the story turns strange. Winston Churchill personally ordered the destruction of most of the Colossus machines after the war, reportedly instructing that they be broken into pieces no larger than a man's hand. Circuit diagrams were burned. Operators who had spent months or years running the most advanced computing machinery on Earth were sent home under threat of prosecution should they ever describe their work, an obligation many honored for the rest of their lives, some taking the details of what they had done to their graves. 2 machines were quietly retained by the newly formed government communications headquarters and continued limited operational use into the 1950s, but their origin and true significance stayed classified. The wider public, and indeed most of the scientific community, remained entirely unaware that Colossus had existed until information about ultra-intelligence began to surface publicly in the 1970s, and full technical detail about Colossus itself was not released until decades after that, well into the 1990s and 2000s. The consequence was a historical injustice with real professional cost. Tommy Flowers, the man who had built the first large-scale electronic computer, received comparatively little public recognition during his working life, his contribution overshadowed for years by the greater post-war fame of Alan Turing, who is sometimes still mistakenly credited with Colossus itself, despite his own most direct code-breaking contribution being to the earlier electromechanical bomb used against Enigma rather than to Colossus. Flowers eventually received an honorary doctorate from Newcastle University in 1976, and further recognition in the years before his death in 1998, but for most of his career, the scale of what he achieved at Dollis Hill simply could not be spoken of. Britain, in effect, invented an entire branch of modern technology, and then spent a generation unable to claim it. Today, a working reconstruction of Colossus Mark II stands at the National Museum of Computing on the Bletchley Park site. the result of a painstaking rebuilding project led by the engineer Tony Sale between 1993 and 2007, using surviving fragments of documentation, wartime photographs, and the memories of veterans who had finally been permitted to speak. It runs, glows, and clatters much as the original did, a monument built from historical detective work as much as from valves and wire, standing in the same rooms where the machine once operated in total silence about its own purpose. The final and perhaps most striking legacy of Colossus is the shape of the secret itself. This was not merely a weapon whose specifications needed protecting for a few years until it was superseded. It was a machine whose very existence, the fact that electronic digital computing on this scale had been achieved at all, was judged too dangerous to admit to the world, in case future adversaries drew a straight line back to what British cryptanalysis had achieved and might achieve again. That decision shaped decades of computing history, obscuring Britain's true place in the story, and letting other, later publicly known machines take the credit for a milestone that had, in fact, already quietly passed inside a converted country house in Buckinghamshire. There is a quieter irony buried in that secrecy, too. The engineers who built ENIAC in the United States, and the academic teams who built Britain's own post-war Manchester and Cambridge computers, were in some cases working within a few miles or a few years of people who already knew how to do what they were struggling to invent, yet none of that experience could be shared because none of it was permitted to be discussed. Tommy Flowers himself, in the years after the war, applied to the Bank of England for a loan to develop electronic switching equipment based on what he had learned building Colossus, and was refused, in part because he could not explain to the loan officers what, precisely, his wartime experience actually consisted of. A man who had already built the most advanced computing machine on the planet could not say so in order to secure funding to build the next one. Ideas that might have accelerated Britain's post-war electronics industry by years, instead, sat locked in classified files, doing no one any good at all, while the country that held them struggled to compete with faster-moving, less secretive rivals abroad. Return for a moment to that room in February 1944. The valves are glowing. The tape is screaming past the reading head at nearly 30 miles an hour. A young woman is watching numbers resolve into settings into decrypted German text, decrypted text into decisions that will shape the invasion of Europe, and she cannot tell a single living soul what she has just done. That is the entire story of Colossus in miniature, an achievement so complete and a secret so total that the machine had to disappear the moment it succeeded. It broke ciphers nobody else could break. It processed information faster than any device the world yet knew existed, and then it vanished, deliberately, by design, into a silence that lasted longer than the war itself. Britain built the future in secret, dismantled it with its own hands, and only decades later admitted what had been true all along. Nobody was meant to know. For 30 years, remarkably, nobody did.